Hello and welcome to Wylder Brews. My name is Brian, and we're going to be talking about how to brew an all-grain recipe from start to finish. On this episode, we're only going to be talking about the basics of starting a brew to finishing a brew when it's in its little fermenter. We're not going to talk about how to build a recipe, how to mash in different steps. We're just going to be doing the single step infusion mash, and we're just going to be talking about the basics through and through so that you can see the process from start to finish. So let's get started. We're going to be doing the strike water first, and what that is just the water temperature that we're bringing up to be above what we want the mash to soak in. So what we need to do is bring water up to about 178. For my brews, for 5-gallon system that I use, we bring it up to about 178 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we pour that onto our grain and let that mash for about an hour. And what that does at that degree is it brings it down to that exact or rough exact temperature that we need to convert the starches to the sugars. So we have our strike water, we bring it up to about 178, and then we let that flow down onto our grain. And as we're flowing that onto our grain, we need to make sure that we're stirring it so that there's not clumps or any other things getting stuck. We want to convert all the grain that we have in there into sugar. Once we pour that in, we sit that on the mash for about 1 hour. After we've had our mash and it's sat there for an hour, what we're going to do is we're going to want to take our mash, our wort now, and we're going to want to lauter that or sparge it into the boil kettle so that we can boil it, put the hops in, go through that whole process. So what we're going to do is we have our mash, we're pulling it off, we're lautering it off into the boil kettle, and as we're lautering it off, we're going to be fly sparging, and that's just a technique of sparging that I use. We're fly sparging that grain to pull the rest of the sugars off the grains and get them into the boil kettle. So we have our sparge water. We brought it up to temperature, which we'll go into detail about what temperature it needs to be. We're pouring it over the grain, and we're letting it just run through the grain and let it pull off the sugars from the grain into the boil kettle. Once we get all of our wort that we want into the boil kettle, we're going to bring it up to a boil as quickly as possible. What we're going to be doing is we're going to boil it for an hour so that we can add in some bittering hops, we can add in some flavoring hops, and then at flame out we'll add in some aroma hops, things like that. And we'll talk about all this in future episodes, but for now we're just talking about the basic all grain single step infusion process. Now that we have it in our boil kettle, we did our full hour boil. It was a good rolling boil, making sure we didn't boil over and making a mess all over our property. We now are going to take it and we're going to move it into the fermenter. What we have is basic glass carboy, about 6-gallon carboy, so we have a little lead room for it to blow off when it's fermenting. So we're going to take it and run it through our plate chiller to cool it down to get it into that carboy. And we're making sure that we're bringing it down to a temperature of at least 70 to 80 degrees. If it's anything above 70, we want to give it some time in you're probably going to put it in your closet, or you're going to put it in your cellar, or whatever you have. Somewhere cool, dark is where you're going to want to keep your beer. When it's in there, you want to make sure it's at about 68, 70 degrees before you pitch your yeast. We'll talk about yeast and what kind of yeast we're going to use on a later episode for this particular brew. So stay tuned. Cheers.